Neymiş ya? Ve saat 17.
It's a tradition that we allocate our practical science seminars for Nobel Prizes. And this year, the prizes in physiology and medicine was given by Devrim Yüzaçık from Sabancı University, who works on autophagy, and the Nobel Prize was on autophagy. And following that, it was a chemistry prize was covered by our faculty members from the Department of Chemistry. And today we will do the third one in physics, and our again on Özgür Öktem present the scientific basis of the Nobel Prize for 2016. Before we start, I would like to give you a brief introduction about Özgür. You all probably know very well that he's a genius. Actually,
talking about the overstatement now.
No, but what the second thing is, he's also very determined. So when the two attributes come together, then one becomes a valedictorian. So he was the valedictorian of his class, mentor, and in 1996 he graduated with a double major degree in physics and also in electrical engineering. Afterwards, he went for a PhD to the United States and completed his degree at MIT, followed by a postdoctoral period at Ohio State University. Afterwards, we are awarded Project Bitak Teşvik and other foundation awards. And he has been a leading scholar at Cornell University in the USA and Tsinghua University in China and in Institut Jean-Louis Fontana in France. So we all look forward to learning about the Nobel Prize.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I'll be able to follow this very nice introduction, and I'm reaching the age where one can be impressed by his own CV, mostly because you forget things. So, I find it extremely hard to give a talk on other people's work. So, I hope that I'll be able to do it well today. I have some hope that I'll be able to do it well because this is a subject which has been a theme of my research for many years. So this year, the Swedish Academy of Sciences decided to give a Nobel Prize to these three gentlemen, all British gentlemen, who are all working in the United States. And the citation says, for theoretical discoveries of topological phase transitions and topological phases of matter. First thing I wrote here, red. Generally, physics Nobel Prizes go to experimentalists because physics is an experimental science. You move it forward by doing experiments, but this time it's actually a new theory has come up, a new way of looking at phase transitions has come up because of the work of David Thales, Duncan Haldane, and Michael Kosterlitz. So today what I would like to give you is not exactly a chronological development of the field, but rather I want to be able to give you an overview of the ideas that go into describing phase transitions through a branch of mathematics called topology. So let's start with that. And what's topology? So there are true topologists in the audience, so I'm maybe not qualified to answer that question, but I have dictionaries, so I looked up the definition of topology from a dictionary. It tells me it's the branch of geometry which studies properties which do not change with continuous changes in size or shape. A simple problem in topology is the following. I take two loops, let's say elastic loops, okay, and I interlink them. Now the question is, can I take them apart without breaking any one of them? The answer is no. As much as I pull them, the linking of these two loops is going to be one. So it's really not possible to separate them with continuous deformations. How about linking one loop twice around the other? You may play around with these elastic bands a little bit and you'll figure out that's also not possible. Okay. So this linking number between two loops is what is called a topological invariant. And we basically want to understand if there are properties in nature which behave in a similar way, which under continuous changes do not change. Okay? Now, if you go from just strings in 1D to higher dimensions, it gets more interesting. For example, if you have a sphere, here I'll just write an equation, a simple equation for a sphere, the collection of points which are equidistant from a point in 3D. A simple observation is that it has no hole. On the other hand, if I go and buy some donut, Smith, it's again a three-dimensional shape. I can write another equation. It's basically the set of points which are equidistant to a circle. And I can see that it has one hole. So there is really no way to continuously deform the sphere into a torus. But if I did not show you the shapes, if I just gave you the equations, it would not be as easy to deduce this fact. So topology is actually a way of going from these equations to those invariants in math. And it can actually get more complicated. And this is from a physics paper, so I don't think mathematicians actually spend time with such examples. But here I have a sphere without any holes. That's equivalent to itself. If I actually have a torus, I can bend it, squeeze it, and make a sphere with one hand. If I have two torus, if I have two holes, or if I link two sides of my semi, that's equivalent to a sphere with two hands. If I actually take a cube, the edges of a cube, and make them a little bit fat, okay? So that's a fat sphere, fat cube. That is actually equivalent to a sphere with 5 handles, not 6 handles. So think about it. So it can get complicated. It actually gets more complicated in higher dimensions. Maybe my topologist friends will tell me it gets easy in higher dimensions, but let's not go there. But what does this have to do with physics? So that's the crucial argument we'll talk about today. And if I actually went into 1960s and told the best physicists of that day that topology will be important in physics, they'll probably laugh at me. They'll say, that's an obscure branch of math. How could it actually affect physics? So, what provides the connection to physics? So today, let me first start by defining how we understand order in physics. So I'll define something called order parameter. And the simplest way to think about an order parameter is think of a magnet. Let's say I have a piece of iron. I know that each iron atom itself is like a magnet, so it has a north pole, a south pole. But if I have a lattice of these atoms, pretty much these magnets are free to rotate. Now, I can have two kinds of magnetization. If I take a large enough piece of iron, even if each individual atom is magnetized, if they are randomly arranged, when I take an average over some volume, my magnetization will be very small. Okay? So if all of these arrows are pointing in random directions, their sum will give me 0. Okay? So that's non-magnetized iron. However, even though there is some randomness in the positions, if their average over some finite volume becomes a big vector, a magnetization vector, then I'll say this is the ordered state. And in nature, what we generally see is you go from the disordered state at high temperatures to ordered state at low temperatures. So if I actually take a piece of magnetized iron, if I heat it up around 200 degrees Celsius, it will actually lose its magnetization. I'm going to say, okay, I actually gave so much energy to all my atoms, they started jiggling, their directions started jiggling, and I went from an ordered phase to a disordered phase. So essentially, how can I describe this magnetization? I will think about some field. So at each point in space, I think of some magnetization vector. Right? If this magnetization vector is non-zero, I have an ordered state. So a smooth function of this, instead of thinking about dots, I can actually think of a smooth function in continuous space, and that smooth function I will call as my order parameter. Alright? Now, that's very good. So if I have a magnetized state, let's say at 0 temperature, everyone is looking at the same direction. What happens? How can I excite this state? Or how can I change this state? Now the simplest thing you can do is start with a magnet where all my magnets are looking in the same direction. Give it a little bit of energy, or maybe take a wrench and kick it. Okay, you give it some energy. What you will have is each and every magnet makes a small change in its position. And because magnets influence the direction of nearby magnets, what you will see is you will see waves. Okay? So, and I actually, in my computer, I gave it just a little bit of energy and plotted what the magnetization would look like at small temperature. You see this nice wave structure going through my magnet. Now, the important thing about these excitations is I can actually go from the excited state to the ground state by small deformations at each point. I take each magnet and tilt it a little bit to its correct direction. So such excitations are local, they are wave-like, and here's the thing. In 1950s, even in 1960s, people thought that they understood phase transitions. They said, hey, I have these excitations. If I increase my temperature, I'll have more and more excitations to the point that each local magnet forgets about what was the average of its neighbors. Okay? So they may cause phase transitions, and that was well understood in 1950s. Another important property of these excitations is that they decay quite fast. So if I actually take a wrench and hit my magnet, the magnetization will fluctuate for a while. A few seconds later, it will go back to its ground state. Now, however, not all excitations can decay easily. So here's another kind of excitation. I am actually taking some point in space and ordering all my arrows to point away from that. Okay? That's another kind of magnetization that can happen in a magnet. And here's the interesting thing. Locally, each atom sees all its neighbors are looking in the same direction. So he is not very unhappy. However, to go from such a state to a uniform state, I need to make a global change. In other words, I can ask the following: if I go through a loop which encloses this point, what does the magnetization direction look like? If I go from A and come back to A, it may fluctuate a bit, but overall, my arrow has rotated by exactly 2 pi. And there is no way to get rid of this 2 pi by making small changes locally. All the atoms, at least some of the atoms, must go through a big rotation to go into the uniform state. So, important thing here is local changes of your ordered parameter cannot kill this excitation, which is called the vertex. So, this is similar to taking this one string and closing it onto itself. Okay? If I have a rod, if I put a string around it, I cannot take the string out without breaking either the rod or the string. So this is a topological excitation, the simplest topological excitation you can actually have. And because it needs a global change to decay, such excitations have very long lifetime. And you actually all intuitively know it. If you take a glass of water and shake it a little bit, you'll have some waves on its surface, but they'll go decay very fast. After a while, you'll have a calm glass of water. But if you stir it with a spoon, if you create a vertex, whenever you take out the spoon, it will go on rotating for a much longer time. And why is that? Because locally, each piece of water is flowing together with its neighbors. It has to know about the global structure so that it can actually go down to zero momentum state. Now, I see Ergin, who's a master topologist in the audience, so I think I want to make him a little bit more happy. He looks increasingly agitated. So let me make my definition more mathematical. So I parameter in space, a vector at each point in space. But Erwin would tell me a mapping, my M of x, y, z, is a mapping from the real space into the mx, my, mz order parameter space. So an order parameter is a mapping from my outer space into my internal degrees of freedom. And here's the nice thing. If I take a path in real space, that will have an image in the order parameter space. So that's how you start to build your topology. If you have something non-trivial going on about this mapping, then there's a topological excitation in your magnet, or in things which are more exciting. And that's actually very helpful. There's a branch of topology called homotopy theory, which allows you to classify what kind of topological excitations you have. In the previous example I gave you, the vertex, it was essentially an order parameter with a vertex which is a hole in your plane. And if I have a loop in a plane that's encircling this hole, no matter how much I deform my loop, I cannot take it outside this hole without either breaking the loop or closing the hole. So that's a topological excitation. But if you don't have a two-dimensional flat plane, but another two-dimensional structure, the surface of a sphere, putting a hole onto the surface of a sphere is not equivalent to putting a hole in the plane. Because if I have a loop around this hole on the sphere, I can make my loop grow larger and larger, and on the other side I can shrink it to a point. So a vertex excitation would be a topological excitation in a plane, while it's not going to be a topological excitation on the surface of the sphere. Yes?
Why do we name these excitations?
Because ground state is when order parameter is the same in all points. Okay, so this kind of topological object has an increased energy over the ground state. That's why we call it an excitation. Actually, there is a very good, very well-known topological excitation. It's when you take a piece of superconductor and put it into a magnetic field, what happens is that magnetic flux ordinarily does not go into a superconductor, but in so-called type 2 superconductors, only a certain line becomes normal and accept exactly one flux quantum of magnetic flux. So, I told you about magnets. Superconductor is a kind of a magnet, but instead of having an arrow at each point in space, you actually have a complex number at each point in space. And the phase of that complex number is like the angle of your magnetization is making with some axis. And that's really exciting, because you know that when you go around the vertex, your complex number, just like the vertex in the magnet, changes by 2 pi, and that 2 pi change implies something important. Total flux going through a superconducting vertex is exactly Planck's constant divided by electron charge. And that was one of the first successes of topology in physics. People say, hey, take a superconductor, put it in a magnetic field, there will be vertices, and the amount of magnetic flux going through a vertex will be related to universal constants. Now, that's a simple, I can probably find a lab here with a superconducting material and get a vertex very easily. But people have seen more exotic topological defects. If you actually give more and more magnetic field to a superconductor, instead of putting more and more flux to the same point, you form individual vertices, and these vertices become a lattice. Okay, so this is called a vertex lattice. That's one kind of topological excitation you can have. In 3D, you can have more interesting things. If your arrows are pointing away from a central point in 3D, that's called a hedgehog, which is kirpi in Turkey, so you basically get the picture. And such an excitation, it's very hard to create in a magnet, but if you create, it again lives for a long time. And very recently, just last year actually, I spent around a week trying to understand one paper where they actually show something called Hopf vibration excitation, which is a mapping from a 3D sphere to a 2D sphere, if I'm not mistaken, and they have written such an interesting excitation into a Bose-Einstein condensate. And I am not able to understand it yet, so any help from my mathematician friends will be welcome at that point. But here's the thing. So far, I've talked about these excited states, just like the question asked. So people knew about such things are possible, but they were seen as strange objects, okay? Curiosities, if you want. It takes a lot of effort to create an excitation, and it lives on a long time, but generally you don't see them in nature. That was the prevailing view before this work. So now, let me remind you one more thing where topology, actually the first topological argument in physics I can trace back. You know that if I have an electric charge, Q, electric field lines always go away from it, so that's called an electric charge. But if I try to do the same thing with a magnet, magnetic field lines always close onto themselves, right? So it's they never start from a point. If you try to take a magnet and cut it into two so that you get a north pole and south pole separated, what you get is instead two smaller magnets. So magnetic fields do not start or end up at certain points. The sexy way to talk about that is you say there are no magnetic monopoles, and people have been searching for that for a very long time. So there is no such object, monopole, but basically what I'm saying is that there is no magnetic charge. Now, why is that important? Because one of the founders of quantum mechanics, Dirac, back in 1931, gave a very interesting argument. He said, let's assume that there is a magnetic monopole. Okay? And I'm putting it onto the surface of a sphere which doesn't really look. Can you see the sphere? No. Okay. So let's say that there's a magnetic monopole at the center of a sphere, and I put an electron onto the surface of the sphere. So the electron would see a magnetic field going away from the sphere at each point, like a hedgehog again. And he showed that for quantum mechanics to be consistent, the charge of any charged object must be an integer multiple of electron charge. So that's a very interesting observation. We know that all charge in nature comes in multiples of E. You never observe 5.3 E isolated charge. It's either 5E or 6E. And Dirac showed that even if there is one magnetic monopole in nature, for consistent quantum mechanics, I must have quantized charge. And people have been looking for magnetic monopoles in everything from the soil from moon to icebergs in Antarctica. No one has seen one. Yes.
What about the quarks?
That's an excellent question. Now, quarks, we all know, have 1/3 or 2/3 of charge. But have you ever heard of an isolated quark? You cannot have an isolated quark just because of that. Quarks must come in pairs, forming mesons, or triplets, forming baryons, so that the total charge, isolated charge, is either 1 or 0. Okay? So you cannot have isolated charge that's less than an electron charge. So, how do you create these defects topologically? One is that you actually design the system. Okay. In that Hopf vibration paper, they actually spent I don't know how many pages discussing how they could create that vibration. But the simplest thing is, if you have a superconductor, put it in a magnet. If you have a superfluid, just rotate it. Another way to create topological excitation is start from some disordered state and cool it extremely fast. In that case, for example, for a magnet, what you would see is that you would form domains, and in between domains and domain boundaries, you can start forming vertices. And remember, once these vertices are formed, they live for a long time. And the prevailing opinion is that if you actually have a physical system, those topological excitations are not going to change your ground state. They will not spontaneously occur. Why not? Because to be able to spontaneously create such an excitation, you need a global change. Okay? Just making local changes cannot create a topological excitation, and in any material, one piece of the system would learn about what happens in the other piece after some time. So there is some time delay for the information to get from one point to the other. That means a global change is unlikely. Right? So picture was that, okay, these are really cool, okay, topological excitations, but they are like elephants. You actually have to go to the zoo to see them. They will not come marching down the street and trample you. So, in 1970s, there was a crisis in physics. And people have very successfully understood what happens in a three-dimensional magnet. They said, I have the ordered state at high temperatures, low temperatures. I have the disordered state at high temperatures. And because of all these fluctuations, I know the phase transition. How can I characterize the phase transition? If I'm in the disordered state, if I look at the directions of two magnets far apart, the direction information actually decays exponentially. So if I go a few of these lengths away, I will no longer remember the direction of my spin, my magnet. On the other hand, in lower dimensions, in lower temperatures, the magnetization direction is remembered. I go from one end of the magnet to the other end, and both spins, both magnets are moving in the same direction. So that was the theory. It matches with the experiment. Excellent. That's great. But then people said, hey, let's do a simpler system. What happens if I grow just one atomic layer of the magnet? And then they do the calculation. And calculation tells us that there is no phase transition. Always, this information about magnetization direction decays as a power law, not exponentially. So there is no low temperature phase, high temperature phase. It should always be uniform. But then they did the experiment, and there was a clear phase transition. So that was the crisis. People were saying, okay, either this theory is wrong, or most probably these are not very good experiments. So people kept doing the experiments again and again, and they could all see a phase transition. And here come the work of Kosterlitz and Thales. They said, hey, maybe you don't these elephants into zoo vertices. We don't expect them in our street, and why don't we expect them? Because to put one vertex into my magnet, I need to change everyone's direction. That's very costly. That costs a lot of energy. It's unlikely. What happens if I take a vertex which is rotating one way and a vertex which is rotating the other way? So a plus minus, a vertex of topological charge plus 1 and a vertex of topological charge minus 1. In that case, it turns out you don't have to change the direction of all the magnets. You just have to do a local change. And such a local change is likely. So Kosterlitz and Talbot said, hey, if that's only a local modification, then it actually is energetically favorable to make these excitations. So they gave this vertex pair unbinding scenario of a phase transition. At low temperature, I have bound vertex pair. A vertex anti-vertex pair is created and then it annihilates itself. But if I go to high temperatures, what happens is that just like the dissociation of an atom, these vertices become free. The total density of vertices is 0, but there is verticity all throughout my magnet, and magnetization is suddenly killed. You go from power law correlations to exponentially decaying correlations. So you get a phase transition. And that matched the experiments perfect. What they basically said is that this transition into the magnet is like going from a gas to a plasma when you heat. So vertices and anti-vertices just become unbound. And this is called DKT transition. So it resolves the crisis about these 2D magnets, and as soon as it was successful in that, it was deployed to much larger range of phase transitions in superconductors, Redox junction arrays, in melting of two-dimensional solids. And maybe the most important realization is that you should never count out these topological excitations, because they can live for a long time. If there is any mechanism to create them, they will change the physics of your system. The first paper was written by Kosterlitz and Tallis, so the paper is actually very qualitative. It just talks about this can happen. Plus, minus vertex, they can dissociate, and that will give you correlations. Kosterlitz then carried out more calculations, more detailed calculations, so he made the first connections to the experiments. And another important thing we learned is that low-dimensional systems they can have very different physics from high-dimensional systems. So people started looking for 2D materials like the graphene revolution. This work is a precursor of that. People actually wanted to. People understood that low-dimensional does not mean that the system is simple. It can actually be more interesting. So here's a book, a recent book, 40 years of Berezinski, Kosterlitz, Tallis theory. And since I showed the slide, everyone is asking who is Berezinski. So here is Vladimir Berezinski. He actually published 2 papers, 1 year and 2 years before Kosterlitz and Tallis. He talks about the importance of vertices in 2D. He has this vertex molecule plus minus. However, he doesn't mention the phase transition, so it's really important work, but he hasn't made this connection to the experiments. And in 1970s, Soviet papers did not come to. There was no internet. I see a lot of young people here. It's very shocking to them, but papers were actually, printed out and then carried by people to other countries. So it actually took a few years for paper written in Moscow to reach England or the United States. Translators were all human. There was no Google Translate. He did some important work. And the question is, does he deserve a piece of the Nobel Prize? Now, thankfully, we don't have to answer that because Nobel Prizes are not given to people who have passed away. So you have to stay alive. The first rule of getting a Nobel Prize. Okay? So, unfortunately, he passed away at a very young age in 1980. Now, let me talk a little bit more about the experimental confirmation. So, what especially Kosterlitz did is he actually estimated measurable things like the superfluous fluid density or the conductivity of a 2D material, he had this very nice line, and about 5 or 6 different experiments from different systems, they all nicely line up with that. That was indirect proof of the theory, experimental support for the theory. About 10 years ago, people had actually seen in combatants these vertex anti-vertex pairs appearing out of nothing and killing the order. Yes?
Why they not appear in 3D?
In 3D, it's possible to have a topological translation. You need a more straight order parameter. It's essentially saying that vertices have length, right, in 3D. So you actually have to put in some object that has a length. So it makes entropically more unfavorable. That's why 2D comes up with vertices all the time. In 3D, there are other kinds of order parameters which cause topological transitions. So right now, I think that those experiments are actually very important for this Nobel Prize, because without direct observation of this pair unbinding mechanism, I don't think that there would be a Nobel Prize for Kosterlitz and Thalles. Now let me tell you how the field has changed after that observation. There was another